In the small, sleepy town of Eldridge, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, there lived a child named Eli. Eli was no ordinary child. He possessed a peculiar ability that set him apart from everyone else. From the moment he could understand the world around him, Eli could see the lifespan of every person he met. It was as if a faint, glowing number hovered above each person's head, counting down the seconds, minutes, and years they had left to live. At first, Eli didn't understand what the numbers meant. When he was just a toddler, he would point at people and babble incoherently, trying to make sense of the strange digits that followed them like shadows. His parents, unaware of his gift, thought it was just a phase, a child's imagination running wild. But as Eli grew older, he began to realize the gravity of what he was seeing. The numbers were always accurate. When his grandmother passed away, the number above her head had reached 0 just moments before she took her last breath. Eli had watched in silent horror as the digits ticked down, powerless to stop the inevitable. He tried to warn her, to tell her that her time was running out, but she only smiled and patted his head, unaware of the dark truth he carried. As Eli grew older, he learned to keep his ability a secret. The townsfolk of Eldridge were superstitious, and he knew that if they discovered his gift, they would either fear him or try to exploit him. So, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with others, and did his best to ignore the numbers that haunted his every waking moment. But there was one number that Eli couldn't ignore: his own. Above his own head, the number glowed faintly, a constant reminder of his own mortality. It was a large number, far larger than most he had seen, but it was still there, ticking down with each passing second. Eli often wondered what it would be like to live without the weight of that number hanging over him, to live in blissful ignorance like everyone else. One day, as Eli walked home from school, he noticed something strange. The numbers above the heads of the townsfolk were changing. At first, it was subtle, a day shaved off here, a few hours there. But as the days passed, the changes became more drastic. People who had once had decades left to live now had only weeks. The numbers were shrinking, and Eli had no idea why. Panic began to spread through the town as people started falling ill. It was a strange sickness, one that the doctors couldn't explain. Those who fell ill would waste away, their bodies growing weaker and weaker until they finally succumbed to the disease. Eli watched in horror as the numbers above their heads dwindled to nothing, their lives extinguished like candles in the wind. Eli knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand by and watch as the people he had grown up with died one by one. But what could he do? He was just a child, and his gift was a curse as much as it was a blessing. He couldn't stop the numbers from counting down, and he couldn't save everyone. But maybe, just maybe, he could find out what was causing the numbers to change. And so Eli set out on a journey to uncover the truth. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to try. The fate of Eldridge, and perhaps the world, depended on it. Eli's journey began at the edge of the Eldridge forest, a place the townsfolk rarely ventured. The woods were ancient, their gnarled trees stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Legends spoke of strange happenings in the forest, disappearances, whispers in the wind, and shadows that moved when no one was around. But Eli had no choice. If there was something causing the numbers to shrink, it had to be connected to the forest. The air felt heavier here, as if the trees themselves were watching him. As he stepped into the forest, the numbers above the heads of the birds and animals he passed flickered erratically. A squirrel scurried up a tree, its number dropping from years to mere hours before stabilizing again. Eli's heart raced. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just affecting the people of Eldridge, it was affecting everything. The deeper Eli went, the more the forest seemed to come alive. The wind carried faint whispers, too soft to make out but too deliberate to ignore. He tried to focus on the path ahead, but the numbers above his own head and those of the creatures around him were a constant distraction. His own number, once so large, now seemed to waver, as if something was testing its stability. After hours of walking, Eli stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk twisted and blackened as if it had been struck by lightning. At the base of the tree was a hollow, and inside the hollow was something that made Eli's blood run cold, a small, intricately carved box. The box seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the numbers above Eli's head and the animals around him flickered wildly as he approached it. Eli hesitated. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he couldn't. He had to know what was inside. With trembling hands, he reached for the box and opened it. Inside was a mirror, but not an ordinary one. The surface was dark, like a pool of ink, and as Eli stared into it, he saw not his reflection, but a swirling mass of shadows. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Eli felt a pull, as if the mirror was trying to draw him in. He slammed the box shut, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The moment the box closed, the forest fell silent. The whispers stopped and the air grew still, but Eli knew something had changed. The numbers above his head and those of the creatures around him had stabilized, but they were smaller now, much smaller. Whatever was in that box had taken something from him, from all of them. Eli knew he couldn't leave the box in the forest. Whatever it was dangerous and he couldn't risk someone else finding it. He tucked it under his arm and began the long walk back to town, his mind racing with questions. What was the box? Why did it affect the numbers? And most importantly, how could he stop it? When Eli returned to Eldridge, he found the town in chaos. More people had fallen ill, and the numbers above their heads were dropping faster than ever. Eli knew he had to act quickly. He hid the box in his room, careful not to open it again, and began to research. He scoured the town's library, looking for any mention of the box or the forest, but found nothing. It was as if the box had no history, no origin. Frustrated and desperate, Eli decided to seek help from the one person in town who might know something. Old Man Hargrove, the town's recluse. Hargrove lived on the outskirts of Eldridge, in a crumbling house surrounded by overgrown gardens. He was rumored to be a witch, or at least someone who dabbled in the occult. Eli had never believed the rumors, but now he was willing to try anything. When Eli arrived at Hargrove's house, the old man was waiting for him, as if he had been expecting him. Hargrove's eyes, sharp and piercing, seemed to see right through Eli. Above his head, Eli saw a number, one that was surprisingly large, given Hargrove's age. But there was something strange about it. The number flickered, just like the others, but it didn't shrink. It was as if Hargrove was somehow immune to whatever was affecting everyone else. "I've been waiting for you, Eli," Hargrove said, his voice gravelly and low. "I felt the disturbance in the forest. You found it, haven't you? The box." Eli nodded, too stunned to speak. Hargrove gestured for him to come inside, and Eli followed, clutching the box tightly. The inside of the house was cluttered with strange artifacts. Jars filled with unidentifiable substances, books with titles in languages Eli couldn't read, and symbols carved into the walls. Hargrove led him to a small table and motioned for him to sit. "Tell me everything," Hargrove said, his eyes never leaving the box. Eli did as he was told, recounting his journey into the forest and the discovery of the box. When he finished, Hargrove leaned back in his chair, a look of grim understanding on his face. "You've stumbled upon something far older and more dangerous than you can imagine," Hargrove said. "That box is no ordinary object. It's a vessel, a prison, if you will, for something that should never have been freed." Eli's heart pounded. "What is it?" Hargrove hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "It's a shadow of the past, a remnant of a time when the world was ruled by forces beyond human comprehension. The box was created to contain it, to keep it from influencing the world. But now that it's been opened, even briefly, its influence is spreading. That's why the numbers are changing. It's feeding on time itself." Eli felt a chill run down his spine. "How do we stop it?" Hargrove's expression darkened. "We can't. Not without a price. The box must be sealed again, but to do that, we'll need something or someone to take its place." Eli didn't like the sound of that. "What do you mean?" Hargrove leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Eli's. "The box requires a sacrifice. Someone must willingly give their time, their life, to seal it. Otherwise, it will continue to consume everything around it until there's nothing left." Eli's mind raced. He had always known his gift was a burden, but he had never imagined it would come to this. He looked down at the box, then at the number above his own head. It was still large, but it was shrinking faster now. He didn't have much time. "What happens if I do it?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hargrove's expression softened, but there was no comfort in his words. "If you sacrifice yourself, the box will be sealed, and the numbers will return to normal. But you'll be gone. Your time will be up." Eli swallowed hard. He had always known his gift came with a price, but he had never imagined it would cost him his life. But what choice did he have? If he didn't act, everyone in Eldridge, and perhaps beyond, would die. "I'll do it," Eli said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Hargrove nodded, a look of grim respect in his eyes. Then we have no time to waste. But be warned, Eli. Once the box is sealed, there's no going back. Eli knew the risks, but he also knew he had no other choice. The fate of Eldridge, and perhaps the world, rested in his hands. Eli sat in Old Man Hargrove's dimly lit study, the box resting on the table between them. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and something metallic, like blood. Hargrove had been preparing for hours, gathering strange ingredients and chanting in a language Eli didn't recognize. The old man's hands moved with practiced precision, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Even he, with all his knowledge, seemed afraid of what they were about to do. The ritual is simple in theory, Hargrove explained, his voice low and measured, but it requires absolute focus. The box must be sealed with a piece of your essence, your time, your life force. Once the ritual begins, there's no turning back. Do you understand? Eli nodded, though his stomach churned. He glanced at the number above his head. It was still shrinking, faster now, as if the box sensed what he was about to do. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his nerves. I understand. What do I need to do? Hargrove placed a small silver dagger on the table. Its blade was etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when Eli looked at them too closely. When I give the signal, you must cut your palm and let your blood drip onto the box. As you do, you must focus on your gift, on the numbers you see. Imagine them flowing into the box, sealing it shut. The rest is up to me. Eli picked up the dagger, its weight cold and unfamiliar in his hand. He had never been afraid of blood, but the thought of willingly spilling his own made his skin crawl. Still, he knew there was no other way. He took a deep breath and nodded. I'm ready. Hargrove began the ritual, his voice rising and falling in a haunting chant. The air in the room grew heavy and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, as if alive. Eli felt a strange pull, like the box was calling to him, urging him to open it again. He clenched his teeth, resisting the urge. Now, Eli. Hargrove's voice cut through the haze. Eli didn't hesitate. He pressed the blade to his palm and sliced it open, wincing at the sharp pain. Blood welled up and dripped onto the box, sizzling as it made contact. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic than before, but Eli focused on the numbers. He imagined them flowing from his mind into the box, filling it with the essence of his gift. The box began to tremble, its dark energy surging. The shadows in the room swirled around it, forming a vortex that threatened to pull Eli in. He held his ground, his hand steady as his blood continued to drip onto the box. The numbers above his head were shrinking rapidly now, but he didn't look. He couldn't afford to. Hargrove's chanting grew louder, his voice almost a shout. The symbols on the dagger glowed with a faint, silver light, and the box's trembling intensified. For a moment, it seemed like the ritual was working. The shadows began to recede, and the whispers grew quieter. But then something went wrong. The box let out a deafening shriek, and a burst of dark energy exploded from it, throwing Eli and Hargrove across the room. Eli hit the wall hard, the breath knocked out of him. He struggled to his feet, his vision swimming, and looked at the box. It was open again, the mirror inside glowing with an eerie, black light. Hargrove groaned, clutching his side. It's too strong, he muttered. It's fighting back. Eli's heart sank. The numbers above his head were almost gone, and the box's influence was spreading faster than ever. He could feel it like a cold hand gripping his chest. He had failed. But then an idea struck him. The box needed a sacrifice, a life force to seal it. But what if it didn't have to be his? What if there was another way? Hargrove, Eli said, his voice trembling. What if we gave it something else? Something bigger? Hargrove looked at him, his eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? Eli took a deep breath. The forest. The box came from the forest, right? What if we took it back there and gave it the forest? The trees, the animals, everything. Would that be enough? Hargrove's expression shifted from confusion to realization. You're talking about a mass sacrifice. It's risky, but it might work. The forest is ancient, full of life force. If we can channel it into the box, it might be enough to seal it. Eli nodded, though the idea made him sick. He didn't want to harm the forest, but he didn't see any other choice. Let's do it. Hargrove hesitated, then nodded. We'll need to act quickly. The box's influence is spreading. If we don't stop it soon, it will be too late. They gathered what they needed and set out for the forest, the box clutched tightly in Eli's arms. The journey was a blur, the trees seeming to close in around them as they went deeper. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, but Eli ignored them. He had to focus. When they reached the clearing with the twisted oak tree, Hargrove began setting up the ritual. He carved symbols into the ground and placed candles at the cardinal points, their flames flickering unnaturally. Eli stood in the center, the box at his feet, and waited for Hargrove's signal. "When I start the chant, you must open the box," Hargrove instructed. "But this time, instead of focusing on your gift, focus on the forest. Imagine its life force flowing into the box. Do you understand?" Eli nodded, though his hands were shaking. He didn't know if he could do it, but he had to try. Hargrove began the chant, his voice echoing through the clearing. The air grew heavy and the ground beneath Eli's feet seemed to tremble. He took a deep breath and opened the box. The moment the box was open, the forest came alive. The trees groaned, their branches twisting and writhing as if in pain. The animals fled, their numbers flickering wildly. Eli focused on the forest, imagining its life force flowing into the box. He could feel it, a vast, ancient energy that seemed to stretch on forever. The box began to tremble, its dark energy surging. The shadows in the clearing swirled around it, forming a vortex that threatened to consume everything. Eli held his ground, his mind focused on the forest. He could feel the box's hunger, its desperate need for more, but he didn't give in. He poured everything he had into the ritual, his own life force mingling with the forest's. And then, with a deafening crack, the box slammed shut. The forest fell silent, the shadows receding as if they had never been there. The numbers above Eli's head stabilized, though they were much smaller than before. He collapsed to his knees, exhausted but relieved. It was over. Hargrove approached, his expression unreadable. "You did it," he said quietly. "The box is sealed." Eli nodded, though he didn't feel like celebrating. The forest had paid a heavy price, and so had he. His gift was weaker now, the numbers fainter and harder to see. But it was a small price to pay for saving Eldridge. As they left the clearing, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that the box wasn't truly gone. It was sealed, yes, but it was still there, waiting. And one day, it might find a way to open again. The days that followed the ritual were a blur for Eli. The townsfolk of Eldridge, unaware of what had transpired in the forest, slowly began to recover from the strange illness that had plagued them. The numbers above their heads stabilized, though they were smaller than before, as if the box had taken a piece of everyone's time, even in its defeat. Eli kept to himself, avoiding the curious glances and whispered questions of his neighbors. He couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened, not when he barely understood it himself. Old Man Hargrove, however, was not so easily dismissed. He visited Eli often, bringing with him strange books and artifacts, as if trying to piece together the mystery of the box. The old man's demeanor had changed since the ritual. He was quieter, more pensive, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "The box is sealed," Hargrove said one evening as they sat in Eli's small, dimly lit room. "But it's not gone. It's still out there, waiting. And it's not the only one." Eli frowned, his stomach twisting at the thought. "What do you mean?" Hargrove leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "The box is just one piece of a larger puzzle. There are other artifacts, other vessels scattered across the world. Each one contains a fragment of the same dark force. If even one of them is opened, the others will grow stronger. It's only a matter of time before someone finds another." Eli's heart sank. He had hoped that sealing the box would be the end of it, but now it seemed like it was only the beginning. "What can we do?" Hargrove hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "We need to find the other artifacts before someone else does. But it won't be easy. They're hidden, protected by traps and curses. And even if we find them, sealing them will require sacrifices just like the box." Eli's mind raced. He had already given so much, but he knew he couldn't stop now. If there were other artifacts out there, he had to find them. He couldn't let anyone else suffer because of his failure. "I'll help," Eli said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "But I need to know everything." "This is where we start," Hargrove said. "The Forest of Whispers. It's said to hold another artifact, one tied to the force of death. But getting there won't be easy. The forest is cursed, and those who enter rarely return." Eli stared at the map, his mind racing. The Forest of Whispers was far from Eldridge, a journey that would take weeks, if not months. And even if they made it there was no guarantee they would survive. But he knew he had no choice. If the artifact in the forest was as dangerous as Hargrove said, they had to find it before someone else did. "When do we leave?" Eli asked, his voice quiet but resolute. Hargrove studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We leave at dawn. But be warned, Eli, this journey will test you in ways you can't imagine. Are you sure you're ready?" Eli didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he had to try. He had already lost so much, but he couldn't let fear stop him now. He looked at the number above his head, smaller than it had ever been, and took a deep breath. "I'm ready," he said. The journey to the Forest of Whispers was long and arduous. They traveled by foot, avoiding the main roads and sticking to the shadows. Hargrove seemed to know the way, his steps sure and steady despite his age. Eli followed close behind, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. As they drew closer to the forest, the air grew colder, and the landscape became more desolate. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was littered with bones, some human, some animal, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, Eli hesitated. The trees seemed to loom over him, their shadows stretching out like a dark, impenetrable wall. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, and he felt a chill run down his spine. "Stay close," Hargrove said, his voice low, "and whatever you do, don't look back." Eli nodded, though his heart was pounding. He followed Hargrove into the forest, the whispers growing louder with each step. The numbers above his head and those of the creatures around him flickered wildly, as if the forest itself was alive and watching them. They hadn't gone far when they came across the first sign of trouble, a clearing filled with strange, black flowers. The flowers seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the air around them was thick with the scent of rot. Hargrove stopped, his expression grim. "This is a trap," he said. "The flowers feed on life force. If we get too close, they'll drain us dry." Eli's stomach churned. "How do we get past them?" Hargrove reached into his bag and pulled out a small vial filled with a silvery liquid. "This will protect us, but only for a short time. We'll have to move quickly." He handed the vial to Eli, who drank it without hesitation. The liquid was cold and bitter, but it seemed to strengthen him, pushing back the whispers and the oppressive weight of the forest. Hargrove did the same, then gestured for Eli to follow. They moved through the clearing as quickly as they could, the flowers hissing and writhing as they passed. Eli could feel their hunger, their desperate need to feed, but the liquid kept them at bay. When they finally reached the other side, Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. But their relief was short-lived. As they continued deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting and writhing as if trying to grab them. The numbers above Eli's head flickered wildly, and he felt a growing sense of dread. And then they saw it. In the center of a small, dark clearing stood a pedestal, and on the pedestal was a small, intricately carved statue. The statue was of a hooded figure, its face hidden in shadow, and it seemed to radiate a dark, malevolent energy. The whispers grew deafening, and Eli felt a pull, as if the statue was calling to him. "That's it," Hargrove said, his voice barely audible over the whispers. "The artifact." Eli took a step forward, but Hargrove grabbed his arm. "Be careful. It's dangerous." Eli nodded, though his heart was pounding. He approached the pedestal slowly, his eyes fixed on the statue. The numbers above his head were shrinking rapidly now, and he knew he didn't have much time. As he reached out to touch the statue, the whispers stopped. The forest fell silent, and for a moment, everything was still. And then, the statue's eyes glowed red. The moment the statue's eyes glowed red, Eli felt a surge of cold, dark energy rush through him. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic than before, and the forest seemed to come alive around him. The trees twisted and groaned, their branches reaching out like claws, and the ground beneath his feet trembled. Hargrove shouted something, but Eli couldn't hear him over the deafening roar in his ears. He tried to pull his hand away from the statue, but it was as if his fingers were fused to it. The dark energy pulsed through him, filling his mind with visions of death and decay. Endless fields of bones, rivers of blood, and a vast, endless void where time itself seemed to unravel. Eli! Hargrove's voice broke through the chaos, sharp and urgent. Focus! You have to fight it! Eli clenched his teeth, trying to push back the visions. He focused on the numbers, the faint, glowing digits that had always been his anchor. They flickered wildly, shrinking and growing as the statue's energy fought for control. He could feel it, the artifact's hunger, its desperate need to consume. But he also felt something else. A faint, flickering resistance, as if the forest itself was trying to help him. With a surge of effort, Eli tore his hand away from the statue. The moment he did, the forest fell silent again, the whispers fading into nothing. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked at Hargrove. The old man's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to seal it," Hargrove said, his voice trembling. "Now." Eli nodded, though his hands were shaking. He didn't know if he had the strength to do it again, but he knew he had no choice. The statue was too dangerous to leave unsealed. Hargrove began the ritual, his voice rising and falling in a haunting chant. The air grew heavy and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Eli stood in the center of the clearing, the statue at his feet, and waited for Hargrove's signal. "When I give the word, you must cut your palm and let your blood drip onto the statue," Hargrove instructed. "Focus on the numbers, just like before. Imagine them flowing into the statue, sealing it shut." Eli nodded, though his stomach churned. He picked up the silver dagger Hargrove had given him, its blade cold and heavy in his hand. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Now!" Hargrove shouted. Eli pressed the blade to his palm and sliced it open, wincing at the sharp pain. Blood welled up and dripped onto the statue, sizzling as it made contact. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic than before, but Eli focused on the numbers. He imagined them flowing from his mind into the statue, filling it with the essence of his gift. The statue began to tremble, its dark energy surging. The shadows in the clearing swirled around it, forming a vortex that threatened to pull Eli in. He held his ground, his hand steady as his blood continued to drip onto the statue. The numbers above his head were shrinking rapidly now, but he didn't look. He could. "If we can channel it into the statue, it might be enough to seal it." Eli nodded, though the idea made him sick. He didn't want to harm the forest, but he didn't see any other choice. "Let's do it." Hargrove hesitated, then nodded. "We'll need to act quickly. The statue's influence is spreading. If we don't stop it soon, it will be too late." They gathered what they needed and began the ritual, the statue at the center of the clearing. Hargrove's chanting grew louder, his voice echoing through the forest. The air grew heavy and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Eli focused on the forest, imagining its life force flowing into the statue. He could feel it, a vast, ancient energy that seemed to stretch on forever. The statue began to tremble, its dark energy surging. The shadows in the clearing swirled around it, forming a vortex that threatened to consume everything. Eli held his ground, his mind focused on the forest. He could feel the statue's hunger, its desperate need for more, but he didn't give in. He poured everything he had into the ritual, his own life force mingling with the forest's. And then, with a deafening crack, the statue shattered. The forest fell silent, the shadows receding as if they had never been there. The numbers above Eli's head stabilized, though they were much smaller than before. He collapsed to his knees, exhausted but relieved. It was over. Hargrove approached, his expression unreadable. "You did it," he said quietly. "The statue is sealed." Eli nodded, though he didn't feel like celebrating. The forest had paid a heavy price, and so had he. His gift was weaker now, the numbers fainter and harder to see. But it was a small price to pay for saving the world from the artifact's darkness. As they left the clearing, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that the statue wasn't truly gone. It was sealed, yes, but it was still there, waiting. And one day it might find a way to open again. Eli and Hargrove returned to Eldridge in silence, the weight of what they had done hanging heavy between them. The forest had been scarred by the ritual, its once vibrant life force diminished. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches bare and brittle, and the animals that remained moved sluggishly, their numbers flickering weakly above their heads. Eli couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him. He had saved the world from the statue's darkness, but at what cost? The townsfolk of Eldridge noticed the change in him. The boy who had once been quiet but curious now carried himself like an old man, his shoulders slumped and his eyes hollow. The numbers above their heads were smaller now, their lives shortened by the box and the statue's influence. Eli could barely bring himself to look at them. He had given so much, but it still didn't feel like enough. Hargrove, too, seemed changed. The old man had always been gruff and secretive, but now there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He spent his days poring over ancient texts and maps, searching for clues about the other artifacts. Eli knew they couldn't stop, not when there were still more vessels out there waiting to be found. But the thought of facing another artifact, of making another sacrifice, filled him with dread. And if they're not sealed properly, the consequences will be catastrophic. Eli clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. There has to be another way. A way to destroy them, not just seal them. Something that doesn't require us to keep sacrificing pieces of ourselves. Hargrove sighed, his shoulders sagging. If there is, I haven't found it. The artifacts are tied to forces beyond our understanding. Sealing them is the only way to contain their power. Eli looked at the number above his head. It was so small now, barely a flicker. He didn't have much time left, and he knew it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they were missing, something important. What if we're going about this the wrong way? Eli asked, his voice trembling. What if the artifacts aren't just vessels for dark forces? What if there's something else? Hargrove frowned, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? Eli hesitated, trying to put his thoughts into words. The box and the statue, they didn't just take life force. They took time. They changed the numbers. What if they're not just containers for dark forces? What if they're tools? Tools that someone or something created to control time itself. Hargrove's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked almost afraid. That's a dangerous thought, he said slowly. If the artifacts are tools, then someone must have made them. And if they were made to control time, then maybe we don't need to seal them, Eli said, his voice gaining strength. Maybe we need to understand them. If we can figure out how they work, maybe we can use them to undo the damage they've caused. Hargrove stared at him, his expression a mix of awe and fear. Eli, if you're right, then this changes everything. But it's also incredibly dangerous. If we try to use the artifacts instead of sealing them, we could make things worse. Much worse. Eli nodded, though his heart was pounding. He knew it was a risk, but he also knew he couldn't keep going like this. He didn't have much time left, and he had to try something, anything, to fix what had been broken. I'll do it, Eli said, his voice steady. I'll take the risk, but I need your help. Hargrove studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but we'll need to be careful. If we're going to do this, we need to find another artifact, one that's tied to time itself. And we need to be prepared for the consequences. The journey to find the next artifact was even more perilous than the last. They traveled to the ruins of an ancient city, its crumbling walls and shattered towers standing as a testament to a long-forgotten civilization. The artifact they sought was said to be hidden deep within the city's heart, guarded by traps and curses that had claimed the lives of countless explorers. When they finally found it, Eli's breath caught in his throat. The artifact was a clock, a small, ornate timepiece that seemed to hum with a strange, otherworldly energy. The numbers above Eli's head flickered wildly as he approached it, and he could feel the pull of time itself, as if the clock was trying to draw him in. This is it, Hargrove said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Chronos device. It's said to control the flow of time itself. Eli reached out to touch the clock, his fingers trembling. The moment he did, the world around him seemed to shift. The ruins of the city faded away, replaced by a vast, endless void where time itself seemed to unravel. He saw glimpses of the past and the future, moments of joy and sorrow, life and death, all swirling together in a chaotic dance. And then he saw it. A figure shrouded in shadow, standing at the center of the void. The figure turned to him, its eyes glowing with a fierce, golden light. "You've come far, child," the figure said, its voice echoing through the void. "But do you truly understand what you seek?" Eli's heart pounded, but he forced himself to speak. "I want to fix what's been broken. I want to undo the damage the artifacts have caused." The figure studied him for a long moment, then nodded. The artifacts were never meant to be sealed. They were meant to be used to control the flow of time and maintain the balance of the world. But they were corrupted, twisted by those who sought to use them for their own gain. Eli's mind raced. Can they be fixed? Can the damage be undone? The figure hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but it will require a great sacrifice. To restore the balance, you must give up your gift, your ability to see the numbers. Without it, you will be blind to the flow of time, but the artifacts will be purified and the world will be set right. Eli didn't hesitate. I'll do it. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and Eli felt a surge of energy rush through him. The numbers above his head flickered and faded, and the world around him shifted again. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the ruins, the Chronos device in his hands. Hargrove stared at him, his expression a mix of awe and fear. What happened? Eli smiled, though his heart ached. It's over. The artifacts are purified. The balance is restored. Hargrove nodded, though he looked troubled. And your gift? Eli looked at the numbers above Hargrove's head. They were gone. For the first time in his life, he couldn't see them. He felt a pang of loss, but also a sense of peace. It's gone, Eli said quietly. But it was worth it. Eli returned to Eldridge a changed boy. The numbers were gone, and with them, the weight of his gift. He no longer knew how much time anyone had left, but he found that he didn't need to. He lived each day as it came, cherishing the moments he had with the people he loved. The forest began to heal, its trees growing strong and vibrant once more. The townsfolk of Eldridge recovered, their lives no longer shadowed by the artifact's influence. And though Eli knew there were still mysteries in the world, still forces beyond his understanding, he also knew that he had done what he could to set things right. As he stood at the edge of the forest, watching the sun set over the horizon, Eli felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey had been long and painful, but it had been worth it. He had given up his gift, but in doing so, he had gained something far more precious, a chance to live. And for the first time in his life, Eli felt free.